Fun fact about Iraq, it's called the cradle of civilizations. And do you know why? It's because it's gone through every major first in human history. From the first time we ever wrote down a word to the first time we ever used a wheel. But while most of us associate this land with recent news headlines, Iraq in 2025 is actually a surprise boomtown of construction cranes and a 7,000-year-old soul that is reclaiming its own narrative. Today we're going to find out how the land where everything started is planning for a future that's anything but certain. It all started around 4,800 BC with the Sumerians. These guys were the ultimate main characters of history. They didn't just survive, they leveled up humanity. They gave us the first writing system called cuneiform, the wheel, and a math system based on the number 60. So every time you look at a clock and see 60 minutes, you can thank the Sumerians for that. But as time went on, eventually a man named Sargon of Akkad came along and decided one city wasn't enough. He conquered the Sumerians and created what many consider the world's first empire, known as the Akkadian Empire. After the Akkadians, the region split into two names you've definitely heard in history class: Assyria in the north and Babylonia in the south. In Babylon, King Hammurabi dropped the first ever legal terms and conditions for society, and his code gave us the famous eye for an eye philosophy. Later, King Nebuchadnezzar II turned Babylon into an ancient Vegas, home to the Hanging Gardens and the Ishtar Gate. It was the peak of ancient clout. Eventually, the neighbourhood got crowded, and Iraq became the ultimate prize for the world's first superpowers. First, the Persians under Cyrus the Great swept in and ended the Babylonian era, turning Mesopotamia into a core part of the Achaemenid Empire. Then Alexander the Great from Greece showed up, defeated the Persians, and actually loved Babylon so much he wanted to make it the capital of his entire global empire. But after the Greeks, things got messy, because for the next several centuries, Iraq became the Berlin Wall of the ancient world. On one side, you had the Romans, who were desperate to control the trade routes. On the other, you had the Parthians and later the Sassanids, or the New Persians. The Romans, led by Emperor Trajan, actually managed to conquer the territory and declare it a Roman province in 116 AD. But it was short-lived. They pulled back after only a couple of years because it was just too hard to hold. And for most of that time, the Romans held the west, the Persians held the east, and the land of Iraq was the constant shifting battleground between them, until the Arab conquest changed the game entirely in the 7th century. But the real shift happened in 636 AD when Arab forces arrived. They were the ones who first called the land Iraq, meaning the fertile. Fast forward to the 8th century, and the Abbasid Caliphate builds Baghdad. Then, for the next 500 years, Baghdad became more than just a capital. It was the centre of the universe. So, while Europe was in the Dark Ages, Baghdad was in a golden age. We're talking massive universities, medical breakthroughs, and the best literature on the planet. It was the global HQ for science and math until the Mongols showed up in 1258 and, unfortunately, burned the place down. After the Mongols, Iraq spent centuries under Ottoman rule. Back then, it wasn't one country yet. It was 3 provinces: Mosul up north, Baghdad in the centre, and Basra down south. Then came World War I. The Ottomans lost and the British moved in, smelling oil and strategic advantage. That's why in 1920, the British basically drew lines on a map and recognised it as a country called Iraq. Also, they flew in a king from Syria named Faisal I and tried to run things from behind the scenes. As you can imagine, Iraqis weren't thrilled about foreign management. So the next few decades were a chaotic mix of independence, uprisings, and military coups, eventually leading to the end of the monarchy in 1958. In 1979, Saddam Hussein took the wheel through the Ba'ath Party. His era was defined by absolute control and a string of devastating wars. First an 8-year grind with Iran, then the invasion of Kuwait, which led to the 1991 Gulf War. The biggest turning point for modern Iraq, however, was 2003. A US-led coalition toppled Saddam Hussein, ending the dictatorship but leaving a massive hole in leadership that led to years of instability and the rise of groups like ISIS. But here's the part that you might overlook while watching the news. Iraq is incredibly resilient. Since 2005, Iraqis have been voting in national elections, and building a constitutional government. It hasn't been easy, of course, and to this day they're still dealing with regional politics and rebuilding after ISIS. But there is a real sense of Iraqi identity growing. Today, nearly 60% of people identify as Iraqi first, before any religious or ethnic label. And honestly, they're just getting started on their next chapter. So if the history of Iraq is the story of humanity's first steps, the geography of Iraq is the stage that made those steps possible. To get a better appreciation of the land, you have to picture the Fertile Crescent. Imagine an otherwise dry, arid region, but with this massive green wing stretching across the Middle East. That is Iraq. It is a big country, roughly 438,314 square kilometres, or about 169,235 square miles. It sits right on the same latitude as the southern United States, tucked between Turkey to the north, Iran to the east, and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to the south, with Syria and Jordan holding down the western border. When you look at a map, the first thing that jumps out is the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. These two are the lifeblood of the nation, flowing southeast from the highlands of Turkey down toward the Persian Gulf. They created a region the Greeks called Mesopotamia, or the land between two rivers, while the locals call the upper part Al-Jazira, which literally means the island. Most people live along the fertile plains created by these rivers because, let's be honest, the rest of the neighbourhood is pretty tough. About 40% of the country is a rocky, stony desert in the west and southwest. This desert is actually part of the Syrian desert, and while it looks empty, it is crossed by wadis, which are dry riverbeds that can suddenly turn into torrential floods during winter rains. If you move to the north and northeast, the landscape completely flips. This is the highland region, covering about 92,000 square kilometres, or 35,500 square miles. Here you will find rolling steppes that turn into massive mountains reaching heights of 1,000 to nearly 4,000 metres, which is roughly 3,300 to 13,000 feet. The highest one is Chikha Dar, reaching a height of around 3,611 metres, or 11,847 feet. But really, everything about this place is beautiful, but rugged, and it is where most Iraqi Kurds live. This area is also super important for the economy because it is home to the massive oil fields near Mosul and Kirkuk. Speaking of oil, Iraq actually holds the fifth largest proven petroleum reserves in the world, estimated at around 145 billion barrels, along with massive amounts of natural gas. More on that later. For now, let's go back to the landscape, because down in the south and central parts of the country, you hit the alluvial plains. This area is like a giant delta where the rivers have deposited silt for thousands of years. In fact, the ground here builds up by about 20 centimetres, or 8 inches, every century. It is incredibly fertile, but also a bit of a challenge because the rivers carry a lot of salt. As you move south toward the Persian Gulf, the soil gets saltier, which is why you see places like Bahr al-Mil, or the Sea of Salt. On top of that, near the city of Al-Qurna, the two rivers finally meet to form the Shatt al-Arab. This area used to be a permanent marshland full of unique wildlife and cultures. And today, that permanent marshland is facing a critical survival struggle as upstream dams and record droughts have dried up nearly 70% of the water, forcing many of the local marsh Arabs to become climate refugees. But the situation gets more complicated because of the salt tide coming from the Persian Gulf, which is essentially pushing saltwater back into the Shatt al-Arab and destroying the area's iconic date palms and wildlife. Now, if you've seen the news lately, you might have noticed headlines about Baghdad being a surprise boomtown. It's true. You'll see construction cranes everywhere, and Prime Minister Soudani even used a crane as his campaign symbol. But under all that new concrete, there is a very complex political machine and some serious economic hurdles. Iraq just wrapped up its national elections on November 11th, 2025, and the results were a bit of a good news, bad news situation. The good news? Voter turnout hit 56.11%, which shows people are still showing up. Plus, Iraq has a pretty inclusive rule where 25% of parliamentary seats are reserved for women, and 9 seats are set aside for minorities. The bad news? No one won a clear majority. In the 329-member legislature, forming a government is like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while riding a roller coaster. It can take nearly a year of back and forth negotiations between the Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish blocs. And right now, the trend is toward a general manager style of prime minister, or someone who executes the plan rather than calling all the shots. One of the biggest shifts happening right now is the closure of UNAMI, also known as the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq. They've been around since 2003, but they are packing up their bags to leave by December 31st, 2025. So what does this mean? It's essentially a signal to the world that Iraq is no longer a conflict zone in need of a referee. Rather, it's a sovereign nation ready to handle its own domestic situation. And this message could potentially bring positive changes to the economy. Speaking of, Iraq's economy is a giant oil well with a country attached to it. As of 2025, the projected GDP is around $265 billion, with slight variations between IMF and Statista. Oil makes up more than 90% of the government's income. That's great when prices are high, but it could leave Iraq highly vulnerable when prices are lower, leading to instability. So while oil brings in the cash, water remains a major threat. Because of climate change and dams in neighbouring Turkey and Iran, the Tigris and Euphrates are at record lows, meaning if there's no water, there's no agriculture. As a result, food prices will go up, and people will be forced to move from farms to already crowded cities. Since we're talking about cities, we can't ignore the security side. Yes, the country is much safer than it was a decade ago, but there are still asymmetric attacks from remnants of ISIL. And just so you see the bigger picture, between April and October of 2025, there were 21 attributed attacks. On the bright side, the government is working hard to bring various militia groups under state control. So the million-dollar question is Iraq turning the corner? Well, it's a bit of a yes-but situation. The cranes are moving, the oil is flowing, and the UN is leaving because the country is stable enough to stand on its own. The real test for 2026 will be whether they'll be able to fix the water crisis and create jobs for 50% of the population under age 25. For now, let's look past the headlines and into the homes, markets, and ancient streets where 7,000 years of heritage are still very much alive. Iraqis are known globally for two things above all else: an almost legendary sense of hospitality and a profound resilience. You want to know why? It's because socially, the Iraqi way is built on respect. It's a culture where humility and generosity are the highest currency. You'll see men greeting each other with warm handshakes or kisses on the cheek, and there is a deep, unspoken rule about honouring the elderly and mothers. If you're walking through an Iraqi city, you'll see a fascinating mix of the ancient and the modern. For instance, in Baghdad, you might see a young guy in jeans walking past an older man in a traditional dishdasha or a long robe. In the north, Kurdish men often wear distinctive baggy pants with a wide sash, while women don vibrant, shimmering dresses that are absolute works of art. But if you want to feel the pulse of the culture, you need to head to the markets. Take the Al-Safafir copper market in Baghdad. It's been there since the Abbasid Caliphate, and the sound of hammers hitting metal has been the soundtrack of that street for centuries. While you're in the market, don't forget to check out the local food, because Iraqi cuisine is a literal greatest hits of the Middle East. It's a mix of Turkish, Iranian, and Levantine flavours. The national dish is mazgoof. It's carp, split open and grilled over an open fire. And the staples. You've got your classics like kebabs, falafel, and dolma, which are stuffed grape leaves. Here's the thing with Iraqi cuisine, though. While people are eating, they're likely listening to music that dates back to the invention of the lute. Iraqis are incredibly proud of their maqams. These are a complex system of melodic modes. But Iraq's true obsession? Football. The national team's victory in the 2007 Asian Cup is still talked about as a moment that united the entire country. Isn't that something? At the end of the day, Iraq is a country that has seen the rise and fall of countless empires, but the spirit of its people remains unchanged. They are a community that identifies deeply with their land, their families, and a history that belongs to all of us. So, we've seen Iraq survive everything from the Mongols to the salt tides of today. Looking at everything we covered, what do you think is Iraq's greatest superpower as it moves into this next chapter? Its history, its resources, or that legendary sense of hospitality? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.